Good morning. Happy New Year. It's the first day of 2023, and I'm still scratching my head thinking, geez, what happened to that Y2K thing, 23 years ago when we thought, the world was going to end. And now here we are 23 years later, and everything is still A-OK. Well, it's functionable, isn't it? Well, we've been looking at putting fear in its place. And for the child of God, for the person who's a believer, for the Christian, fear is something that we need to learn to conquer, and we do not conquer it by becoming bolder or getting more courage. Like the lion. The lion needed courage in the Wizard of Oz. We don't get it that way. We get it by strengthening our faith. The opposite of fear is faith. Not courage, not boldness, not all those other things, or not just mustering up strength. It's faith. It's putting your faith in God, and this is a great story we're going to look at today, where we can be reminded of a time when not only Peter but all the disciples, Jesus taught them this lesson that it's not about courage to defeat your fears. It's about putting your faith in God. So Jesus is the one who helps us through fearful circumstances. Maybe you've approached some fearful circumstances this week. Let me look back on my week and think about what happened. Oh, our dryer quit. Had to get a new dryer this week. Jordan was here and we thought something was maybe leaking again in his water. Oh, his dishwasher has leaked and ruined his basement ceiling. So we got to get all that done. I tried to work on that, and then I had to see if the dryer is fixable. It's not. So then I had to see if we can get a new one. We did. So thanks to George Burgess for taking his truck and helping me pick one up, and thanks to him for hauling the old one off. It was, a blessing all the way around. And then I had to hook it up. I had to, it had been out in the country, so I had to switch the orifices, make it natural gas rather than propane. Had to deal with all that, but it works. Everything's good. Cleaned it all up. Cheaper than a new one to buy a used one. It's about 7 years old. Gave $100 for it. Don't think I can complain. It worked yesterday. Dried clothes. Everything's good. Had to do that. Had to change the oil in the car yesterday, and I'm just getting too old to crawl up and down and lay on a creeper. It's starting to hurt my joints. Plus, in between the old dryer and Jordan's dishwasher, I pulled a muscle in my calf, and today's the first day I really feel like I can almost walk on it. So I don't know what that is all about. I don't know if that has anything to do with fear, but I'm telling you, I've been trusting the Lord to get better all week long, and just for things to happen, things to change, and aren't you glad we have a new year? Doesn't matter what last year's failures were or what our fears were. We have a new year to learn how to trust the Lord, and so it's a great place for us to start. And that is, our title is Submission. No. Number 5, Courage in Place of Fear. And for us to be able to put, I don't believe just courage, but I believe put our faith in place of fear. Our courage comes because of the confidence we have in knowing that our faith is in a God who is bigger than any of our fears or any of our problems or anything else. So that's where we're going to begin today. And we go to a maybe familiar story to you. Maybe it's a story you haven't really studied much, or maybe it's one you don't quite understand yet. Well, when we get to heaven, maybe we'll have to ask, what did that all mean? But in the meantime, we can say, this is what it means for us today. And the story is this: Jesus walked on the water. Now, get your head around that if you can, because it's pretty potent. Jesus, it doesn't say he was skating on the water. It doesn't say he had a log that he was balancing on. It doesn't say that he was somehow gliding along. He was walking on the water as if it were dry ground. Get that picture in your mind. the Sea of Galilee is not a very big place. Matter of fact, it would be just a good fishing lake in most of North Missouri, or even any state, Minnesota. It's just a good little fishing lake. It's not very big. You can see from one tip to the other pretty much. They say it's about 13 and a half miles long from the north to the south. It's about 8 miles wide from the east to the west. And on a clear day, you can see all the way around it because it's just down in this little basin. And to the north are the Lebanese mountains, or the base of those. To the west is the Highland Plains that from the Sea of or from the the Mediterranean Sea kind of comes up, and then it drops down in here where what we call the Galilee is. To the other side is Jordan, and it has banks on it. And then to the south is the Jordan River Valley, the land of Jordan, the country of Jordan. And then to south of it is the Jordan River Valley. And so you just can look all the way around it. We stayed in the city of Tiberias, which is on the kind of southwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. And in the morning, when the sun came up over there on the east, and you could see the shadow on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Really a neat place. So people used the lake, to boat from point to point because it's not good terrain, and all the way around it, you might have to walk, or you might have to go up and down and up and down. And so if you had a boat, or if you could secure a boat, you could go from one point to the other on the boat, and probably about half the time, and you didn't wear yourself out. So they used it for transportation a lot. Through there was kind of the break, because they would cut through the north part of there in order to go to the northeast, and so it was commercial area, commercial highway. Plus, we have learned in recent years, we know of Mary Magdalene. And they'd say, why was she Mary Magdalene? Well, because she was from the town of Magdala, but nobody knew where Magdala was. And so they looked and looked and looked, and then they discovered in the northwest, the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee was a little city, was a little place where there was fish. They salted fish, they preserved fish, they caught it, they preserved it, and then they sold it. And that's what Magdala means, is salt fish. And so that's where they believe the town of Magdala was, in the Galilee. Fishing was a big industry for there. It was a big part of the economy. We know Jesus went there to Capernaum, and he called his disciples. That's where many of them came from. Capernaum is on the northern tip of the Sea of Galilee. And they were there, and Jesus worked out of there a lot once he really settled into doing ministry in that area. So Jesus traveled about the region. Sometimes they used boats, sometimes they walked a lot, if it was inland. But the fishermen that Jesus called to be his disciples certainly would have known all about the Sea of Galilee, because that's where they fished. Okay, so let's begin. And the first thing we want to look at is act on what God tells you to do. That ought to be rule number one in a believer's life, hadn't it? When you repent of your sin, when you realize you need a Savior and Jesus is the only one who can help, then acting upon what he says ought to be the first thing that we do, ought to be priority. So let's dive right in here. Matthew 14, beginning of verse 22, it says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. Why were there a bunch of crowds? Well, because Jesus had fed a bunch of people, and he'd been there teaching. He'd been there telling them about the kingdom of God. And so he fed thousands. And so he wanted to get the disciples out of there. We'll talk about that in a minute. So after dismissing the crowds, it says in verse 23, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Well into the night, He was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat was already some distance from the land, battered by the waves because the wind was against them. Jesus came toward them, walking on the sea very early in the morning. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. Again, act on what God tells you to do. So they've just wrapped up feeding 5,000 people. And it's somewhere along Bethsaida, somewhere near that area. We don't know exactly where it was for sure, but we can speculate where it was. Somewhere in that area, northeast shore of the lake. Jesus had been teaching. That's where it had probably taken place. And so, what did he do? He put the disciples in the boat and sent them out. And so, there, if you can imagine, they're in the northeast part, and he is sending them down to more of a a southwestern part of the lake. And so, they're kind of crossing across the northern tip of the Sea of Galilee, um, uh, toward Gennesaret, which we would kind of believe is probably south of Tiberias, down in the not quite to where the Jordan River drains out, but north of that, on the northwest part of that a little bit. So, why did Jesus send them out alone? Why did he send them by themselves in the boat? Why did he usher them into the boat and send them on their way rather than them all doing this together? We don't know. We can't understand. It's never really spelled out, but there might have been some reasons. Jesus might have been really needing to get alone. And of all of us, Jesus was the one who truly, genuinely understands what it is to feed on the power of the Holy Spirit. So, did he need to be refreshed? Had it drained him? Did he need to get alone with God to figure out what's next? Maybe, or had performing the miracle drained him physically. We don't understand it all. So it could be he just needed to be alone. Also, maybe because right before this is when the story is told of the death of John the Baptist. Maybe Jesus needed to talk to the Father about what does all this really mean, and how am I supposed to view this? Possibly, it was just prayer time, and he needed to get away. But he may have sent them away for them to kind of clear their minds, get out on the sea where many of them were comfortable, take a sigh, catch their breath, get away from the crowd to where they're not going to be tempted to do something foolish or react in a negative way or whatever. And so he just sent them out. Whatever the reason, Jesus stayed behind, and after he had dispersed the crowd, he went to the mountain to pray. What maybe wouldn't have taken all that long, but because of the season of the year, we speculate, they got out into the sea, and the winds, as they come from the Mediterranean, and they come across the Mediterranean Sea, and they have a certain force. Once they go up over those mountains and then come down into the Galilean Valley, they pick up speed. They are called Scirocco winds because they're speedy, because they're gaining as they go. And those Scirocco winds come down off the cliffs into the Galilean basin, and they really pick up speed. And in nothing flat, storm can blow in, and it can be pretty nasty. Happens in the rainy season of the year. And so there they were, conditions. You might be saying, well, they were fishermen. They knew the lake. Why did they get on the lake at that time of year? Well, I think that's because they blindly trusted Jesus. He told them to do it, so they did it. You'll recall back in Matthew 8, I believe it's Matthew 8, they were out on the boat, and Jesus went to sleep, and the storm came up, and he's sleeping through it, and they're riding it out, and they're saying, what in the world is wrong with him? Can't he tell we're about to all die here? And Jesus got up and said, where's your faith, guys? And then he said, be still. And the winds quit. And it tells us that the disciples were all like, what manner of man is this? That's the King James uh, what manner of man is this? But, in modern translations, it's, who in the world is this guy? What is he doing? Well, they kind of knew. And so Jesus is gradually revealing himself to them. So it's well into the night, and the disciples have tried to face the wind because the winds come from the west. They're coming from the northeast to cross down to the southwest. They're coming across the lake, and they're working, and it's not very easy. And they've gotten about out in the middle of the lake, and now it's gotten worse. And they've been at it all night. We don't know really what time it was, but it says well into the night. Um, Most would say, why did Jesus send them away? For a teachable moment. He's about to teach them who he really is. And he's going to do it in such a way that there's no disputing. So they're already some distance from the land, it says. The wind was against them. They're battered by the waves. It's tumultuous. It's a fearful moment. And they know what it is to be out in the wind like that on the lake. And you get to shore as quick as you can. You let the wind take you wherever you will. You end up wherever. We'll worry about it when the wind dies down. But they were trying to get where Jesus sent them, couldn't get there. Every reason to be fearful. Their terror was legitimate. It's understandable that they were still trying to make it happen. And then what did they see? Early in the morning, Jesus is walking on the water out to them. And actually, I'm sure they didn't see him right away because it's night, it's dark, and there's a storm brewing. Um, uh, but he came by them in Mark 6:48. Mark says he was about to pass by the boat. In other words, you begin to think, was Jesus just going to walk right on past him? Was this a foot race? Was he trying to get there before them? We don't know, do we? But it was a teachable moment. And why did they come to this point? So that they could learn more about who he was. So here was Jesus. They used the word ghost. They were shocked. Here was this guy coming by, and the word for ghost can also be translated like a supernatural or an apparition. Something out of the ordinary, something that wasn't right. If you saw somebody walking on the water to you, you would think, is it not that deep? Is it that shallow? What is the deal? And yet you would know better because of where you were. And so here he came. They use this term ghost. The only other place it's used, it's used in Mark 6:49, but it's used here as well. And the disciples knew they were seeing something strange, something out of the ordinary. Again, he was walking. He wasn't sliding along. He was walking on the water as if he were just walking anywhere. Why did this happen? For them to better understand who he was. And we look at it and say, wow, this is the point. Wow, this is the point. Wow, this is the point. Or we won't get to the point until we get to the end here, what Jesus was really saying. But can you imagine how fearful they would be? And yet, what is Jesus trying to teach them? Trust him even when you're fearful. Trust him even when things do not seem right. Trust him in the storms of life. Why were the disciples willing to take a boat across the sea? We don't know, but we do know that Jesus was teaching them the truth. Here's something to hang on to out of this. Jesus always faithfully shows up when you need him most. It's the way it is, isn't it? He always shows up, especially in the storms. So remember that in the storms of life. Are you alone? No, never. Never alone. He's always with you. Okay, then we go to the second point, and that is fear sets in when you take your eyes off Jesus. As long as our faith is strong and we're fixed on him, all is well. But when we take our eyes off him, then we begin to sink like Peter. So immediately Jesus spoke to them. It says in verse 27, have courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. And he said to them, it is I. That's the same structure, the same construct as what God said to Moses in Exodus 3, where Moses said, "Who are you?" And God said, "I am that I am." So Jesus is saying there, "I am." Um, Peter says in verse 28, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." And so, climbing out of the boat, Peter started walking on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the strength of the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Just a couple of things you need to be aware of in this. Number one, faith always requires you to get out of the boat. That's the way it is. There are times when you can stay in the boat and be comfortable. There are other times when you got to get out of the boat if you're going to be faithful to Jesus. So always be listening. Does he say come? If he does, you better go. You better follow. So Jesus said to them, "Have courage. It is I. I am." He's declaring, "I am God" to them. Don't be afraid. In other words, he knew they were afraid. He knew this was going to upset their understanding of the world, but he was trying to calm them down to realize they could broaden their perspective on what the world really is about. So, Greek terminology, there again, it is Yahweh, it is God. And because he was Yahweh, they could have courage. So, that would have been a pretty frightening moment for any of us. But Peter, he's always kind of talkative and kind of speaking out. And he said, "Well, if it's really you, why can't I do what you're doing? Have me come to you." And so Jesus said, "Come." He commanded him to go out on the water. And when Peter stepped out of the boat, as long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, all was well. That's the way it is when you're going through the storms of life, folks. Don't ever look around. Don't ever think, "Oh, do I have the strength to do this? Oh, can I make it? Oh, is this going to consume me?" No. Once you stepped out in faith and once you have put your trust in God, don't look back. Don't look around. Don't think about things. Don't overthink it. Just realize if God called me to do it, he'll equip me to do it. If God called me to do it, he'll make sure it happens. If God is the one in control, I can obey and do it. And that's what Peter did for a little bit. Once he took his eyes off Jesus, he began to sink. And so when he sank, what did he do? Well, he did what any of us would do. He cried out to God, "Lord, save me." And what did Jesus do? Did he push him down and say, "You have little faith, I'm going to intimidate you out here in front of all the others"? No. He grabbed him and he pulled him up. And, a lot of people speculated, did Jesus wait till he was just about to start sucking water? No, I think once Jesus saw he was in trouble and Peter cried out, Jesus immediately took him. He did not let him doubt for a moment that Jesus was able to save him. Believers, you and I, that's the way we should operate, isn't it? But that runs counter to human nature. It runs counter to our culture. It runs counter to many things that we've been taught in this world. Yet, fear kills our faith. And when we begin to sink, our faith needs to be tested. Our faith needs to be strengthened. Peter's story is every believer's story, isn't it? Has there been a time in your life when maybe you weren't walking on water, but you were doing something that was beyond you because God called you to do it? And in doing it, never take your eyes off the Lord. Never take your eyes off him. Keep focused on him. When we do, we'll get ourselves in trouble. Reaching to Jesus in the moment of faithfulness is the best thing any of us can do. Well, the third part is this. Jesus is there when you return to him. And that is always the promise, isn't it? It says in verse 31 of Matthew 14, immediately Jesus reached out a hand, caught hold of him and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those in the boat worshiped him and said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Just a couple of things in this last bit as we talk about Jesus always being there when we get back focused on him. He's always true. He's always faithful. When Jesus said to him, "You have little faith," he wasn't belittling Peter in any way. He was still compassionate. He was still teaching. He was still helping. He wasn't putting him down. He was helping him understand and know that you got it made if you'll just strengthen your faith. You can make it if you'll just keep your eyes on the Lord. Why did you doubt? Why did you think that it was an impossibility? Well, it's because our human nature kicks in and says, "Oh, you can't do that." When in reality, God is saying, "Trust me. Trust me, you'll see." The second thing out of this is the real lesson. The disciples worshiped him. It says, those in the boat worshiped him and said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." What does it mean to worship? Well, yeah, let me get this here. I can't find it where I wanted to be. What does it mean to worship? Let's see. It evoked worship. It's a proclamation, isn't it? We saw who Jesus was revealing itself, becoming true in clarity. Worship is always a moment of declaring the truth. In this moment, the disciples moved from fear to faith, and they began to understand who Jesus was more and more. The one who gave them courage in the midst of the fearful circumstance was the same one they could trust to see them through no matter what the storm might be. To worship him is really what it is about. What was the whole lesson? For them to get to the point where they said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." What is God doing in your life? What's he doing in my life? What's he doing in our daily living to get us to the point where we can say with not wonder and fear, but with confidence, "You truly are the Son of God." So that's my prayer for you today. It's my prayer for you in the coming year, that as you embark on a new start, you will say, get out of the boat. Don't take your eyes off Jesus. And always remember, he truly is the Son of God. God bless you. Bye-bye. Oh, dear. Time to go. Why didn't that end?